All right, well, let's talk about this more now with Ovigwe Eguegu. He is a policy advisor at the consultancy firm Development Reimagined, and he joins us now from Ankara. Thanks very much for being with us. So I want to ask you, first of all, just give us a sense of how reliant many of these African countries are on grain from Ukraine.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. Well, you might know very recently there was a report by the UN that global food insecurity has worsened, or global hunger in particular has worsened. And that is, again, the backdrop of countries like Somalia, where they've had very terrible droughts, the wars they've had in decades. And this was even before we had the war in Ukraine. So countries like Somalia are very, very food vulnerable. Also, some other countries in Africa are also very dependent on wheat export from Russia and Ukraine, countries like Benin Republic, Egypt, another good example. But overall, even though many African countries are not directly tied, benefiting from importing grain from Russia or Ukraine, the inflationary pressures on the world market, whenever this grain deal is not renewed, translates to high food prices for bread and other wheat-based food products across the world. In African countries across the world also feel the indirect impact through those inflationary pressures. So I think that's really what needs to be emphasized. And immediately the deal was cancelled, wheat futures, were rising as high as 4.2% on Chicago Stock Exchange. So we're already seeing the direct impact, and this translates to higher food prices for people everywhere. And that's why we need this grain deal to be reinstated.
And what impact does this have on the most vulnerable countries the longer this goes on?
Yeah, I think we might begin to see the risk of food insecurity translating to instability in some parts of the world. Like I did mention, countries that are very dependent on wheat exports from this Black Sea Green Deal, they might. There's a lot of inflationary pressures across the world already. So this just worsened the case, and food is such a very key commodity, and there's a fear that this might lead to some form of political unrest.
Do you think something like this, though, could force many African countries to rethink their reliance on grain from countries like Ukraine and Russia? Cause them to kind of diversify their reliance, to look at other places that they can import grain from, so they're not reliant on these two countries?
Yes, definitely. I'll give you an example. If you notice, a country like Ethiopia, for instance, has increased its wheat production by several folds. And this has been a real opportunity. Ethiopia itself already is not entirely food secure, but just because of the consequences of the war and the initial worry about food insecurity, compelled the government to double effort, and they already had at record harvests and even breaking records as at the end of last year. So I think it's a clear signal to African countries that they have to find ways to solve their food problems, because they really can't rely on maybe Russia or Ukraine or even the Black Sea Grain Deal. However, I think the immediate issue is to resume the exports. And you may know that there's a Russia-Africa Economic and Humanitarian Summit at the 27th and 28th of this month. And I see it is very possible that African leaders will put the grain deal on the agenda, and they want to discuss this more directly with President Putin and see how they can at least solve their immediate challenges through some form of mechanism, and in the long term, diversify their food and import locations.
All right, good to talk to you. Ovigwe Eguegu, appreciate your analysis.